Mr. Gelb, I'm very delighted to welcome you in Ukrinform. Thank you for agreeing for a conversation with us. I want to start by asking you, the Metropolitan Opera was one of the first leading cultural institutions to publicly support Ukraine after the full-scale invasion. What was the decisive factor in taking this stance?
Well, first I should say that I regret that our support for Ukraine only began with the invasion. It really should have begun with the war earlier, and it was my ignorance in not beginning our support sooner. But once the invasion began, the idea that the Putin regime was going to try to destroy Ukraine was made it very clear that the only action anyone who has a moral sense of right and wrong could take was to support Ukraine. So as a moral decision, it was very easy to say we must support Ukraine. And the support began within a few days of the invasion. In fact, the first performance the Met had scheduled after the invasion, it was a performance of the opera Don Carlo by Verdi. But before the performance began, I had the cast of the chorus come on stage and sing together with the orchestra the Ukrainian national anthem to send a signal to our audience and to the world that the premier cultural institution, performing arts institution in America, was taking a strong stance. And I'm very glad that we did that. But it did not just, that was not the only gesture. We did many things after that, which I'm happy to talk about.
Your active position about Ukraine has caused both admiration and criticism. Have you ever happened to face pressure or open disagreement to this? How do you react to this?
Well, I've been working in the performing arts since I was a teenager, and I've had leadership positions since I was 30 years old. And I've always faced criticism for various things. When you take strong positions, there is no way that everyone can agree with you. I think, though, the decision to support Ukraine was one that was very much approved of by the members of the Metropolitan Opera Company. We have 2,000 to 3,000 people working at the Met every day, the people who are the employees of the Met, the artists of the Met. And I think it's fair to say that almost all of them, if not all of them, were in agreement with me. I think when you take a position that is correct, that is right, it's very easy to defend. There are some situations in the world where there's a certain ambiguity or things are not so clear whether each side could have some argument that could be right. In the case of this situation of the Putin regime trying to destroy a nation, its sovereign right to exist, its culture, there's no right or wrong. There's only what's right, which is to support Ukraine. So I have no problem defending my position, and I do defend it if necessary to anyone. I also, I regret that some of my colleagues in other opera houses have been around the world who initially were completely in support of Ukraine, and I think most of them still are in support of Ukraine. But they show a certain ambiguity. For example, in the case of artists, when I made the decision to support Ukraine, it was not just a question of playing the national anthem. It was a question of taking actions. And the actions included cutting all the relationships that the Met had professionally with Russian cultural institutions. In fact, 2 days before the invasion, I was in Moscow, the last time I was there, and the last time I will ever be there until the war is won by Ukraine. But I was in Moscow to attend the final dress rehearsal of a co-production between the Metropolitan Opera and the Bolshoi of the Wagner opera Lohengrin, because a few years earlier, I had made an agreement with the Bolshoi to co-produce 3 operas together. And when I was in Moscow for this final dress rehearsal, of course, everyone was aware that Russian troops were gathering in Belarus, but no one seemed to really believe the invasion was going to happen. I think people inside Ukraine didn't believe it either. And so I went to this rehearsal, but when I returned to New York, the invasion began. Almost right as maybe within hours of my arriving in New York City, the invasion started. And immediately, I telephoned, or I didn't telephone, I sent I think an email to Vladimir Yurin, who was the director of the Bolshoi, no longer, because he's been replaced by Gelb, who was really Putin's cultural henchman, a very bad person. But Yurin, who was not a bad man, and in fact, in the early days of the invasion, signed a paper against the war, which was probably why he no longer has his job at the Bolshoi. But whether he's a good man or a bad man didn't matter to me. What mattered was that he worked for Putin. And I contacted him and said, I'm very sorry, but our relationship is over. We are not going to work with you anymore. And I also immediately gave our leading star, Anna Netrebko, the choice of either disavowing Putin and the war or being fired by the Metropolitan. And she chose to stick with Putin, and we fired her. Later on, of course, she made the announcement that she was against the war, but people who know her, I believe, know the truth, that she only did this because I fired her, and as a chance to show that she should be given a way back, if not the Metropolitan, other opera companies. But the decision was made very quickly by me to cut all ties with cultural institutions in Russia and any artists who publicly were connected with Putin or supported him. And also to think of other ways in which we could support Ukraine.
Since you mentioned you've been in Moscow, I imagine the way of acting as they use opera singers, artists, Russian artists, athletes, anyone to promote their authoritarian state. If an opera singer gets a worldwide recognition, then it's a win of Russia, not a win of this opera singer. If a Russian athlete gets a medal, it's a win of Russian people, of Russian nation, and Putin's regime. Do you agree with this view? And is it so that not every artist in the US see this way?
Well, I have to say that my position is evolving, because initially I felt that it was not correct, certainly for the Met. I'm not saying in Ukraine. In Ukraine, I completely understand why it has to be black or white. You are fighting for your survival, and that's why I completely understand and agree that the Russian language should not be spoken, that Russian artists should not be performed. I understand that. I felt from the Metropolitan Opera perspective that a slightly more nuanced position, which was that I did not believe that great Russian composers like Tchaikovsky or Shostakovich, who had nothing to do with the invasion and who died many years ago, should be held hostage by Putin. And I also believed that Russian artists who were not publicly supporting Putin should be given a chance to perform, because I felt that they also were being held maybe hostage by the war. Today, I feel somewhat differently, to be honest. Really my position, since the American government's position has moved away from support of Ukraine, and since, or at the most is ambivalent, and since Putin has taken a position of much more, even more aggressive position in terms of increasing his attacks on the country and escalating the war to another level. I feel now uncomfortable with the idea of letting Russian artists who are actively working in Russia to continue to work at the Met. I have not made this change yet, but I'm thinking seriously about it now, because I felt that it was not fair to Russian artists who maybe could not leave Russia, perhaps, that they should be denied the opportunity of working at the Met. But I feel differently now because there are certainly great Russian artists who have left Russia, and who live outside of Russia and who work outside of Russia. Those are the artists I would like to perform at the Met, not the ones who are staying and working at the Bolshoi or the Mervinsky. So this position you will see changing at the Met in the coming season.
You obviously don't get behind the people who claim that art and culture should remain non-political, but what would you say to those artists in the US who think this way?
Well, I would say they're wrong, because art and culture is political. And the country that has made it the most political is Russia, always. In the 80s, I've been working many years in my profession. I've been the director of the Metropolitan Opera for 20 years. But long before I went to work for the Metropolitan Opera, I was working on cultural exchanges in Russia in the 80s, and also in China in the 80s and 90s. In fact, I was the manager of Vladimir Gorovets, the most famous pianist in the world at the time, who comes from Kyiv. And in the mid-80s, when President Reagan and Gorbachev were negotiating nuclear detente, they agreed it would begin with a cultural exchange. And so I was responsible for the first step in this cultural exchange, which was to bring this great pianist, Vladimir Gorovets, who had left Russia in 1927 and had never returned, to arrange for his first time back in Russia. And it was obvious. So art and politics have always been.
Sorry for that. Sorry for that. You can.
No, I gotta go back. So art and politics have always been connected. First of all, art is a symbol. If we want to live in a civilized world, art is an expression of civilization. It is also a tool of propaganda, and Russia has always used its great art of the past. It's ballerinas, it's musical stars, as symbols of Russian cultural, as symbols of Russian cultural might, and. So this is why I believe, one of the ways in which I've been supporting Ukraine was to help create the Ukrainian Freedom Orchestra as a symbol of Ukrainian culture and with Ukrainian artists to fight back, really, because I understand the Russian psyche. I understand that they believe that Russian artists are somehow demonstrating their cultural kind of superiority or something. And so I think it's very important in these very difficult times that Ukrainian artists are given a chance to show to the world what they have to offer. And I'm very proud of my wife, Carrie Lynn Wilson, who is the conductor inside Ukraine of the Kyiv Kamerata, the chamber ensemble, which specializes, as you know, of course, in featuring only Ukrainian music of great contemporary Ukrainian music from Skorik to Stankovic, all these great great Ukrainian composers, and it's why we are very careful in how we select the programming of the Ukrainian Freedom Orchestra when it performs in capital cities around the world outside of Ukraine. I think it's important both to show the people of Ukraine that the world outside supports them at a time when they must feel very isolated and abandoned by some, to know that they are not abandoned. And I think it's very important to demonstrate to audiences around the world the power of Ukrainian art and Ukrainian culture. And one of the reasons why I'm here in Ukraine this week is to meet with the First Lady of Ukraine, Olena Zelenska, with whom I have met many times already to discuss different cultural projects that can help Ukraine. So to somebody who asks the question, art is not political, I would say they are very naive, that they do not understand that art is political. Of course, I believe in great art, and Ukrainian art is great art, and it is very powerful, and it's very important, particularly at a time when Putin wants to not only destroy Ukraine, but he wants to destroy the memory of Ukrainian art and culture, that we fight back on the cultural front. I am not a politician, I am not a soldier, but I can be a soldier of art for Ukraine.
It's still heartwarming to see the support of Ukraine from the Metropolitan Opera. You already enlisted actions you have taken to support our artists. I want to ask you, you also participated in charity program for Armed Forces of Ukraine. Could you elaborate more? What was that and how was it?
Well, I think if by the charity program, do you mean the program of Olena Zelenska?
Probably, yeah.
Because she launched, that was really my just trying to support her and Ukraine. I will try to support Ukraine in any way I can. My expertise is not the armed forces. My expertise is culture. But when the First Lady launched a charity, and I was asked if the Metropolitan Opera would provide itself as the venue, I immediately said yes. But this is not my area of expertise.
Do you think Ukrainian opera and music receive sufficient recognition around the world? What Ukrainian works or composers do you think deserve special attention?
Well, I myself have learned a lot about Ukrainian composers and art through hearing performances that I might not, if not for the war, if not for the invasion, I might not be as aware of Ukrainian art as I am today. But there are many beautiful and moving works of Ukrainian art that I've listened to. Some of the composers I mentioned before, like Skorik and Stankovic, and there's a wonderful piece I heard the other day by a young composer, Rodin. In fact, one of the new projects, which I think is very important, which is an example of art being able to tell a story that goes beyond the news cycle, is the opera that we just commissioned 2 years ago called The Mothers of Kherson, which is an opera by the Ukrainian composer Maxim Kolimets, which the Metropolitan Opera initiated. The libretto is by an American playwright named George Brandt, but it is a story that was based on research that we had done here in Kyiv and in Ukraine. And although the story is about two mothers who are not real people, but they're based on real people. And it's the story of these two mothers at the beginning of the invasion who are in Kherson, which has been occupied at the time at the beginning of the invasion, has been occupied by the Russians. And these two mothers are desperate to protect their teenage daughters. And because, of course, the men are all away fighting, and so the mothers are left to take care of their children, and they are faced with the frightening possibility that Russian soldiers could rape their daughters, and they wanted to protect their daughters. So when they're told by the school teacher in Kherson that there's an opportunity for their daughters to have a vacation in the Crimea, although they're a little bit nervous to see their daughters go to the Crimea because it's no longer Ukraine, they agree because they think their daughters will be safe. When after a few weeks go by and their daughters don't return, they realize something is wrong, and they see their school teacher going to Moscow, and then they know something's really wrong. They see her getting on a train, leaving Kherson, and then they hear the news conference that Putin's woman who is in charge of the children who are abducted, Maria I can't say her name. Belova.
Maria Lvova-Belova.
Right, sorry, thank you. So she's actually a character in this opera. She's a character in the opera because in the opera, she is holding this press conference, which I saw on the news, where she says to, after she and Putin were both accused by the International Court in Hague of war crimes for stealing children, she holds a press conference and says that any Ukrainian mother who thinks her child has been mistakenly taken into Russian-occupied territory is welcome to come and get their children, which obviously she didn't mean. It's a fake invitation, but she said it. And there was an organization, which I'm sure you know, called Save Ukraine, which helped organize those mothers who wish to try to accept this offer, to try to go and save their children. So the opera is about this story, about these two mothers who, with the help of Save Ukraine, go on this extensive odyssey, this journey where they have to travel across Ukraine, into Poland, into Belarus, into Russia, and into the Crimea to try to rescue their children. And so it's a historically accurate story that I think will help demonstrate to the world, to supplement, and the news cycle comes and goes, but art stays. Good art, great art stays forever. And so this is an artistic work that will forever tell the story, and hopefully will also be will serve a purpose to demonstrate the power of Ukrainian art, and also the power of this human tragedy, and how people can absorb it in an artistic way, not just watching the news. Because every day we watch the news, there's so many terrible things happening in Ukraine and everywhere else in the world. It's hard to keep track of I'm always upset that when Ukraine is being bombed, it's not on the first item in the newspaper or in the television. But the way the news works is it all depends upon how bad things are. If Iran is bombing Israel, if Israel is bombing Iran, who knows what story is going to be the big story of the day. So, but to the point is that this opera usually takes 4 or 5 years for an opera from the time it's commissioned to the time it's performed. We have put this on a fast track. So, which is why last week, 1 or 2 weeks ago, we provided a small excerpt of this opera to the New York Times so that they could put it on in their newspaper, which is read around the world. And this summer, the composer, Maxim Kolimets, even though he's still completing the opera, is taking a segment, making a suite, a 10-minute or 12-minute orchestral suite from the opera that will be performed as the opening piece on the Ukrainian Freedom Orchestra program in various cities around the world. When the opera finally is performed in its full entirety in Warsaw next year, and then at the Metropolitan Opera, we will not only perform it in front of our audience, but we will also broadcast it into movie theaters around the world. So it will be seen by millions of people. So this is how we can help Ukraine, and this is one way we can help Ukraine in a powerful way.
Do you think we see that the mission of art is changing? You already said that with the Mothers of Kherson, you're trying to highlight the actions that are unraveling in Ukraine. How would you shape the mission of art today?
Well, I think for art, particularly, I work in high arts, in opera, and which is always has the risk of losing an audience because it becomes older, and which is why I believe that opera has to constantly be renewing itself and to be telling stories that people today can relate to. At the Metropolitan Opera, we're putting on new operas all the time. We had an opera at the beginning of the season about a female Air Force pilot who became a drone operator and who suffers the guilt of seeing the collateral damage of drone attacks. We have an opera that is opening our season next year called The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay that takes place during World War II and is really it's about the forces of democracy against fascism. These are stories, that mean something to new audiences. And, but art, whether it's popular art, an artist who I think many of the people in the world admire is Bruce Springsteen, who's a very famous, American pop star, who is spending his time talking about what's wrong with the American government and fighting for democracy. I think because artists have big followings, whether they're pop artists or whether they're classical artists, they have an opportunity and a responsibility in a world that is more troubled today than ever before, particularly in Ukraine, but everywhere, to speak out, to use their art, to use their platform, to use their audience, to present the truth. And otherwise we will go back to the dark ages and become primitive people just trying to kill each other, which seems like that's maybe a direction the world is heading. So I think that art can help steer it in the right direction.
During your visit, you already said that you have origins in Ukraine. Your ancestors are from Carpathian village Veliki Komyati, and you actually managed to visit this place. Could you tell us, please, how was it for you and what did you feel out there?
Well, when I grew up in New York City, and my father was a very moral man who was a very famous newspaper man. He started as a copy boy, which is the lowest position at the New York Times, and spent his entire career at the New York Times, rising to become the top managing editor. And through him, I think if I have a strong moral compass, it's because of him, because he really believed in the difference between right and wrong, and believed in a newspaper man's responsibility to tell the truth to the readers, not to use it as propaganda, but to always be accurate. But one thing he was not accurate about was my origins, because he believed that his parents, both of his parents, came from the same village in the Carpathian Mountains, and his father was much older than his mother. So interestingly, even though they came from the same small village of Veliki Komyati, they never met there, and they actually met in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, which is where many immigrants, Jewish immigrants, met. but he believed they were Hungarian. And in fact, as a child, my grandmother was living with us, and she would always be preparing Hungarian dishes like Hungarian goulash and paprikash and these special Hungarian dishes. And so I always thought I was half Hungarian. The governor of the Transcarpathian region explained to me, after I went on this visit to the town, and he explained that the history of this village goes back to the 14th century. And it has been, like other towns in this region, has been like a ping pong ball that is going back and forth from different countries. So it was once Hungarian, but it was also Czech. And since the 1960s, it was acquired by the Soviet Union as part of Ukraine. And so I'm not sure if that makes me Ukrainian or not, because my grandparents left in the early 1900s when it was not part of Ukraine. But according to the governor, the Ukrainian governor, he says I am Ukrainian. So if I am, I'm one half Ukrainian, because my mother's parents came from Lithuania and Romania. But my father's parents came from this village. So if I am Ukrainian, I hope I am, I would be very proud to be Ukrainian. It will not change my position in terms of supporting Ukraine, but it's good to know that I have Ukrainian blood in my veins. So nothing could make me happier than to be Ukrainian.
Anyway, you're a strong supporter of Ukraine, and Mr. Gelb, I thank you for this conversation with us.
Thank you so much, and I can only say Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.